Welcome to the Mystery Archive. This is the home of forgotten stories, unexplained events, and, honestly, some of the strangest anomalies that history has left behind. The auditory onslaught, a symphony of hell. The Western Front presented soldiers with something, well, truly unprecedented in human warfare. A soundscape so relentlessly violent that it became a weapon in itself. Imagine standing in a trench while heavy artillery shells screech overhead every few seconds, each one producing a sound that reaches 140 decibels or more, louder than a jet engine at takeoff. This wasn't just occasional bombardment. During major offensives like the Battle of the Somme, this cacophony continued for days without pause. The British preliminary bombardment alone fired over 1.5 million shells in 7 days, creating an auditory hell that simply never relented. Veterans described the experience as living inside a massive bell being struck continuously. The human ear simply wasn't designed for this level of sustained assault. Unlike earlier conflicts where battles had natural ebbs and flows, the industrialized warfare of the First World War created constant noise that gave soldiers no respite. Machine guns added their staccato rhythm. The German MG-08 could fire between 400 and 600 rounds per minute, while gas alarm klaxons would suddenly pierce through everything with their distinctive, panic-inducing wail. Many soldiers reported that even years after the war ended, sudden loud noises would send them diving for cover or trigger violent panic responses. The medical establishment initially dismissed these reactions as cowardice or weakness, coining the term shell shock to explain what they saw. But this label grossly oversimplified what was actually happening inside these men's minds. Their brains were being subjected to acoustic trauma on a scale never before encountered. The constant barrage prevented normal sleep patterns, making it impossible for the mind to process and file away traumatic experiences. Each new sound layered onto unprocessed horror from hours or minutes before, creating a psychological logjam that would eventually cause complete mental breakdown. When darkness fell over no man's land, soldiers discovered that night offered no sanctuary from sensory assault. Star shells and flares transformed night into an eerie, flickering otherworld, where shadows danced with menacing unpredictability. These magnesium flares burned at such intensity that they created harsh, unnatural light that distorted depth perception and turned familiar objects into threatening shapes. Anyone caught in the open when a flare ignited had to freeze instantly, becoming a living statue while their heart hammered against their ribs. The visual landscape of trench warfare created a paradox that tormented the mind. On one hand, the view rarely changed, the same stretch of devastated ground, the same shell holes filled with murky water, the same splintered tree trunks reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. On the other hand, that static landscape demanded constant vigilance because death could emerge from it at any moment. A slight movement might signal an enemy raid. A distant flash could mean incoming artillery. A wisp of yellowish fog rolling across the ground signaled poison gas. This combination of monotony and mortal threat created a state of hypervigilance that exhausted the visual processing centers of the brain. Soldiers also witnessed things the human mind really struggles to categorize and file away. They watched friends disappear in explosions, leaving nothing but pink mist. They saw men drowning in mud, their desperate struggles growing weaker over hours because, well, No rescue was possible under enemy fire. The injured often lay in no man's land for days, their cries for help creating another layer of psychological torment for those trapped in trenches who just couldn't assist. These visual memories burned themselves into neural pathways with such intensity that honestly many veterans spent the rest of their lives seeing these images whenever they closed their eyes. Military historians often focus on the dramatic elements of combat, the charges, the tactics, the grand strategies, but soldiers lived immersed in a stench that words frankly struggle to capture. The trenches reeked of human waste since proper sanitation was impossible. Bodies lay unburied in no man's land, decomposing in the elements and releasing gases that drifted into the trenches with every breeze. The smell of chlorine gas, phosgene and mustard gas lingered in the soil and on clothing. Gangrene from infected wounds added its distinctive stomach-turning odor. All of this mixed with the copper smell of fresh blood, the acrid bite of cordite from spent ammunition, and the sour stink of fear, sweat, and unwashed bodies. This olfactory nightmare created visceral disgust that compounded psychological distress. Humans are hardwired to react to certain smells with revulsion because they signal danger or disease. Living in an environment that constantly triggered these primal warnings essentially kept soldiers in a state of physiological alarm. The smell of decay became so pervasive that many men reported losing their sense of smell entirely, a defensive adaptation that sometimes never fully recovered. The physical sensations were equally relentless. Soldiers stood in cold, muddy water that reached their knees or higher, sometimes for days. Their feet swelled, turned white, and began to rot, a condition called trench foot that could lead to amputation. Lice infested every uniform and bedroll, creating constant itching that made sleep even more difficult. When shells landed nearby, the concussive force felt like being punched by an invisible giant, leaving men disoriented and nauseous. The damp cold penetrated to the bone, and there was no way to get truly warm or dry. This unending physical misery wore down mental resistance just as effectively as any direct combat trauma. What military doctors in 1914 didn't understand was that the human brain has limits to how much sensory input it can process before systems begin to fail. Modern neuroscience has revealed that chronic stress and sensory overload can actually alter brain structure. The amygdala, which processes fear and emotional responses, becomes hyperactive. The hippocampus, responsible for memory formation and emotional regulation, can actually shrink. The prefrontal cortex, which handles decision-making and rational thought, shows reduced activity. World War I soldiers were experiencing all of these changes without any medical framework to understand or treat what was happening to them. The symptoms manifested in disturbing ways. Men developed uncontrollable tremors, losing the ability to hold a cup or light a cigarette. Some went mute, unable to speak despite having no physical injury to their vocal cords. Others developed tunnel vision, blindness, or paralysis with no organic cause. Many experienced what we now recognize as classic PTSD, intrusive memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, and violent startle responses. Some soldiers simply shut down completely, staring blankly ahead, unresponsive to commands or comfort. Military authorities often viewed these men as malingerers or cowards, subjecting them to harsh discipline or even execution for desertion when they broke and ran from the front. The tragedy deepened when these broken men returned home. Society expected them to simply resume normal life, but their nervous systems remained locked in combat mode. Loud noises triggered panic attacks, and crowds felt threatening. Sleep brought nightmares so vivid that men would wake up screaming or fighting invisible enemies. Many turned to alcohol to numb the constant anxiety. Relationships crumbled because these men couldn't explain what they'd experienced, and their families, well, they couldn't understand why their loved ones had returned as strangers. Suicide rates among veterans climbed steadily in the years following the armistice. The sensory warfare of World War I revealed a truth that military establishments were slow to acknowledge. You can break a mind just as surely as you can break a body, and sometimes those wounds never heal. The advances we've made in understanding trauma, PTSD, and sensory processing disorders really owe a debt to those soldiers who suffered when no one understood what was happening to them. Modern militaries now incorporate psychological screening, stress management training, and post-deployment mental health support, recognition at last that the invisible battlefield is just as real as the physical one. Yet we must remember that for every advance in our understanding, countless veterans endured decades of suffering. Men who survived the trenches spent the rest of their lives flinching at thunder, unable to attend celebrations with fireworks, waking in cold sweats from nightmares that never faded. Their families lived with ghosts, men who looked like their fathers or husbands, but whose minds remained trapped in the mud and blood of France and Belgium. The true casualty count of World War I extends far beyond the names carved on memorials. This story isn't just historical curiosity. It's a reminder that war's cost extends into dimensions we often ignore. When we discuss conflicts, we count tanks and troops, strategies and supplies. But the sensory overload that shattered minds on the Western Front teaches us that human psychology has limits, and, well, those limits must factor into any honest accounting of what war demands and destroys. If this exploration of history's hidden horrors resonated with you, subscribe to the Mystery Archive. We dig deeper into the forgotten stories and unexplained events that shaped our world. Share this video with anyone who appreciates history's untold chapters, and join us as we continue uncovering the mysteries that time tried to bury.